document flow intact. Let's explore some common transform functions. Here's an example of a box element. We've set the body to have a solid black border so you can see the box element nested inside the body element. The translate function moves an element from its current position. Here's an updated example using the translate function. This CSS rule will move the element with the class box 50 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down from its original position. Here's what the modified result looks like on the screen. The rotate function rotates an element around a fixed point. And this is an example of using the rotate function for the box element from earlier. This will rotate the element 45 degrees clockwise. And here's what it looks like. The scale function allows you to change the size of an element. Here's an example. This will make the element 1.5 times wider and twice as tall as its original size. And this is what it looks like. You can combine multiple transformations in a single declaration. This will move the element 50 pixels to the right and down, rotate it by 45 degrees, and scale it to 1.5 times its original size. And here's the result. While the transform property is powerful for creating visually appealing designs, it's important to consider accessibility when using it. Here are some important accessibility concerns to keep in mind. Screen readers may not always accurately convey transformed content. For example, if you use transform to rearrange the visual order of elements, screen readers will still read the content in the original DOM order. This can lead to confusion for users relying on screen readers. When using scale to resize text, be cautious not to make it too small or too large. Extremely small text can be difficult to read, while overly large text might overflow its container and become unreadable. It's generally better to use proper font styling techniques for text resizing. If you're using transform for animation effects, be mindful of users who are sensitive to motion. Excessive or rapid animations can cause discomfort or even trigger seizures in some people. Consider providing a way for users to reduce or turn off animations. When using 3D transforms, remember that not all users perceive depth in the same way. Ensure that any critical information conveyed through 3D effects is also available in a 2D format or through text. If you're using transform to hide or reveal content, make sure that the content is still accessible to screen readers and keyboard navigation. Hidden content should be truly hidden, such as by using display none or visibility hidden, rather than simply being visually moved off screen. When applying transforms to interactive elements like buttons or links, ensure that the clickable area remains intuitive and easily targetable. A drastically transformed button might be visually confusing or difficult to click, especially for users with motor impairments. In conclusion, while the CSS transform property is a powerful tool for creating visually dynamic web designs, it's essential to use it responsibly with accessibility in mind. Always test your transformed elements with various assistive technologies and consider providing alternative ways to access information or functionality that might be affected by transforms. What is the CSS box model and how does it work? The CSS box model is a fundamental concept for web development. It defines how HTML elements are structured and positioned. If you understand this model, you'll be able to control the size, spacing, and appearance of the elements on your website. In the CSS box model, every element is surrounded by a box. This box consists of 4 elements: the content area, the padding, the border, and the margin. The content area is the innermost part of the box. It's the space that contains the actual content of an element, like text or images. You can see the content area in this representation of an HTML element in the CSS box model. The padding is the area immediately after the content area. It's the space between the content area and the border of an element. With padding, you can add space around the content to improve its readability. You can set different values for the top, right, bottom, and left padding with the padding property. This is an example with the padding shorthand property, where we set the top margin to 15 pixels, the left margin to 5 pixels, the bottom margin to 2 pixels, and the left margin to 8 pixels. The border is the outer edge or outline of an element in the CSS box model. It's the visual boundary of the element. You can customize the border's style, width, color, and other properties using the border property. Here's an example where we set the border to a width of 5 pixels, a solid state, and the color blue. If you omit a value, the default value of that property will be used. That's medium for the width, none for the style, and current color for the color. You can set these 3 properties directly in the shorthand border property if you want all sides to be exactly the same. But if you want to assign a different style to each side, you can use the border width, border style, and border color properties. You can write up to 4 values for each one of these properties. They'll be applied in a clockwise sequence, starting from the top. If you only write 1 value, it will be applied to all 4 sides. Finally, the margin is the space outside the border of an element. It determines the distance between an element and other elements around it. You can set different margin values for the top, right, bottom, and left sides of the element using the margin property. So in this example, the top margin is 3 pixels, the right margin is 12 pixels, the bottom margin is 9 pixels, and the left margin is 7 pixels. These 4 components are essential for calculating the total width and height of an element. In the next few lectures, you'll learn more about how this is handled by the browser and how you can customize it. The CSS box model is a fundamental concept for web development. Understanding how these components interact and contribute to an element's dimensions is essential for implementing web designs. What is margin collapsing and how does it work? Margin collapsing is a fundamental concept in CSS that often confuses newcomers to web development. This behavior occurs when the vertical margins of adjacent elements overlap, resulting in a single margin equal to the larger of the two. Understanding margin collapsing is important for precise control over spacing and layout in web design. So let's get into how margin collapsing works and explore some common scenarios where it occurs. In CSS, when two vertical margins come into contact with each other, they'll collapse. This means that instead of adding together, the larger margin wins and determines the space between the elements. This behavior applies only to vertical margins, top and bottom, and not horizontal margins, not the left and right. So here's an example to illustrate this concept. In this example, you might expect the total space between box 1 and box 2 to be 50 pixels, 20 pixels plus 30 pixels. However, due to margin collapsing, the actual space will be 30 pixels, which is the larger of the two margins. Here's what this might look like visually. As we saw in the previous example, margins of adjacent sibling elements will collapse. This is the most straightforward case of margin collapsing. Let's explore more cases where margin collapsing can occur. Margins can also collapse between a parent element and its first or last child. If there's no border, padding, inline content, or clearance to separate the parent's margin from the child's, they will collapse. In this case, you might expect the child to be 70 pixels from the top, 40 pixels plus 30 pixels. However, the margins collapse and the larger margin, 40 pixels, is used. Here's a visual representation. If an element has no content, padding, or border, its top and bottom margins can collapse into a single margin. In this example, the empty block's top and bottom margins collapse into a single 30 pixel margin, the larger of the two. Here's how it might look. Here's another example of preventing collapse using padding. In this case, the 1 pixel padding on the parent prevents the margins from collapsing, resulting in a total space of 71 pixels from the top of the parent to the top of the child content. Here's a visual comparison. Understanding margin collapsing is important for a single 30 pixel margin, the larger of the two. Here's how it might look. Here's another example of preventing collapse using padding. In this case, the 1 pixel padding on the parent prevents the margins from collapsing, resulting in a total space of 71 pixels from the top of the parent to the top of the child content. Here's a visual comparison. Understanding margin collapsing is important for precise control over layout and spacing in CSS. While it can sometimes lead to unexpected results, it's a feature designed to create more aesthetic and consistent spacing in documents. By knowing when margin collapsing occurs and how to prevent it when necessary, you can create more predictable and maintainable layouts in your web designs. What's the difference between content box and border box? The box sizing property can be set to either content box or border box to control how the width and height of elements are calculated. Here you can see the box sizing property and the two possible values. This property is usually set on the root element, HTML, to apply to all the elements within the document. Here you can see how border box is applied to all the elements within the HTML element. The value of the box sizing property is content box by default, but you can choose border box if you need to. We'll explore content box first, and then we'll go into border box. To understand how these models work, you need to be familiar with the 4 core concepts from the CSS box model. Let's review them quickly. The content area is the space occupied by the element's content. The padding is the space between the content area and the border. The border is the outline that surrounds the content area and the padding. The margin is the space outside the border that separates the element from other elements. You can see them all illustrated in this diagram. In the content box model, the width and height that you set for an element determine the dimensions of the content area, but they don't include the padding, border, or margin. You should use content box when you need to have precise control over the dimensions of the content area. So when you set the width and height of an element with the width and height properties, you're only setting the dimensions of the content area. Width is the width of the content, height is the height of the content. To find the total width of the element, what you will really see on the screen, you'll still need to add the left and right padding and the left and right borders. So the total width equals the content width plus the padding left plus the padding right plus the border left plus the border right. Likewise, the total height of an element can be found by adding the content height, the top and border padding, and the top and bottom borders. So the total height equals the content height plus the padding top plus the padding bottom plus the border top plus the border bottom. For example, here we have a CSS type selector for all the div elements. In this case, if content box is used, the content area will have a width of 300 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. However, the total width, what you will really see on the screen, will be the result of adding the width of the content area, which is 300 pixels, plus the padding on both sides, 40 pixels, and the borders on both sides, 8 pixels. Likewise, the total height will be the result of adding the height of the content area, 200 pixels, plus the top and bottom padding, 40 pixels, plus the top and bottom borders, 8 pixels. Great! Now let's explore border box. They're a bit different. With border box, the width and height of an element include the content area, the padding, and the border, but they don't include the margin. You should use border box when you need to keep a fixed element size, regardless of changes in padding or borders. It's also helpful for responsive web design, since the content area will adjust automatically to fit the dimensions. The padding and the border are inside the box, so when you set the width and height properties of an element, you're really setting the width and height of the inner part of the box. Here's our div example with the same properties and values that we had before. With border box, the value of the width property will be the result of adding the width of the content area, the left and right padding, and the left and right border. So the width equals the width of the content plus the left padding plus the right padding plus the left border plus the right border. Likewise, the value of the height property is the result of adding the height of the content area, the top and bottom padding, and the top and bottom border. Height equals height of the content plus top padding plus bottom padding plus top border plus bottom border. The margin is not included in the width or height. If you check the size of the div in the browser using content box and border box, you'll notice that there's a very important difference. These are the two divs in HTML. We assign them IDs to select them individually in CSS. These are the CSS rules for the red div and for the blue div. You can see that they both have the same width, height, padding, border, and margin. The only differences are the colors and the value of the box sizing property. This small difference has a very important impact on the final dimensions. Choosing between content box and border box really depends on the specific needs of your project. While border box is becoming increasingly popular for its simplicity and flexibility, understanding both models is important for implementing effective CSS layouts. What is a CSS reset, and what are some common examples? A CSS reset is a style sheet that removes all or some of the default formatting that web browsers apply to HTML elements. For example, you might have noticed that certain elements, like paragraphs and headings, already have margins by default, even if you don't define them explicitly in your custom style sheets. You also see this with various properties in a wide range of HTML elements. Different browsers may also apply different default styles to HTML elements. The default styles in Google Chrome may not be exactly the same as in Mozilla Firefox or Microsoft Edge. This can result in inconsistent styles across browsers, which you should avoid as much as possible. To handle this, a CSS reset removes the default styles. By removing all or some of the default styles, you can get a consistent baseline for your design and minimize the potential inconsistencies across browsers and devices. Removing default styles can also make the styling process easier because you'll only see the styles that you've applied explicitly in your custom style sheets. There are two main approaches to CSS resets. You can either define custom CSS resets or use third-party CSS resets. Custom CSS resets are style sheets that you create from scratch to fit the needs of your project. This way you can control the specific styles that will be reset, with a lot of room for flexibility. However, you also need to invest time to develop and maintain the style sheet. Here's an example of a very common CSS rule for resetting the margin and padding of all HTML elements. It's usually written at the top of the CSS style sheet. The asterisk or star selector is a wildcard selector that matches all HTML elements, so they will have a default margin of 0 and a default padding of 0 on all four sides. This will give you a starting point, and then you can customize them in more specific CSS selectors further down in the style sheet. You can use this approach to select any HTML element and reset its default styles. Just create a custom style sheet and use the appropriate CSS selectors to match the elements and set the styles. But this can be a time-intensive process. If you want to save time, you can also use a third-party CSS reset. These style sheets are already pre-built, so you can just download them and add them to your project directly. A great example of a third-party CSS reset is normalize.css. This style sheet normalizes styles for a wide range of HTML elements while still keeping some useful default styles, especially those that are important for accessibility. It also corrects bugs and style inconsistencies. Another option is sanitize.css. This is a CSS library that you can use to ensure that default styles will be consistent across all major modern browsers. This library is developed alongside normalize.css, so they evolve together. It also has individual style sheets that you can download for specific purposes, like normalizing forms and typography. There are many options available, but you should choose the ones that best fit your needs of your project. You can also combine both approaches, using third-party CSS resets with custom resets. When working with CSS resets, it's also important to take accessibility into account. Your web application should be accessible to everyone, so you shouldn't reset styles that might be helpful for screen readers or other assistive technologies. You should also consider the impact that these additional style sheets may have on your application's performance, because they will have to be downloaded before the custom styles are applied. By removing default styles, CSS resets give you a blank starting point to implement your design. This results in a more uniform and consistent user experience across browsers and devices. What is the CSS filter property, and what are common examples? The CSS filter property is a powerful tool that allows you to apply graphical effects to elements on a web page. It's particularly useful for adjusting the visual presentation of images, backgrounds, and even text without modifying the original asset. The filter property can be used to create various effects, such as blurring, color shifting, and contrast adjustment. Let's discuss how the filter property works and explore some common examples. The basic syntax for using the filter property is straightforward. Here, function represents the specific filter effect you want to apply, and the amount is typically a value that determines the intensity of the effect. Now let's look at some common filter functions and their uses. The blur function applies a Gaussian blur to the element. The amount is defined in pixels and represents the radius of the blur. This CSS rule will apply a 5-pixel blur to all images on the page. Here's what an image might look like with this filter applied. The blur effect can be useful for creating depth in your design or for obscuring parts of an image. The brightness function adjusts the brightness of the element. A value of 0% will make the element completely black, while values over 100% will increase the brightness. This CSS rule increases the brightness of elements with the class brightImage by 50%. This is what it looks like. Brightness adjustments can be used to make images pop or create a washed out effect. The grayscale function converts the element to grayscale. The amount is defined as a percentage, where 100% is completely grayscale and 0% leaves the image unchanged. This rule will convert elements with the class grayImage to complete grayscale. And here's what it would look like. Grayscale can be used to create a vintage look or de-emphasize certain elements on a page. The sepia function applies a sepia tone to the element. Like grayscale, it uses a percentage of certain elements on a page. A vintage look or Grayscale can be used to create a vintage look or de-emphasize certain elements on a page. The sepia function applies a sepia tone to the element. Like grayscale, it uses a percentage value. This rule applies an 80% sepia effect to elements with the class oldPhoto. And here's what it would look like. The sepia effect is great for creating a vintage or old-timey look. The hueRotate function applies a hue rotation to the element. The value is defined in degrees and represents a rotation around the color circle. This rule rotates the hue of elements with the class colorShift by 90 degrees. And here's what it would look like. Hue rotation can be used to create psychedelic effects or to adjust the overall color scheme of an image. One of the most powerful aspects of the filter property is the ability to combine multiple effects. You can apply several filters to the same element by separating them with spaces. This rule applies increased contrast, slightly increased brightness, and a subtle sepia effect to elements with the class multi-filter. And here's an example of how combining filters can transform an image. By combining filters, you can create complex and with the class multi-filter. And here's an example of how combining filters can transform an image. By combining filters, you can create complex and unique visual effects tailored to your design needs. The CSS filter property is a versatile tool that allows for creative visual manipulation of web elements. While we've covered some of the most common filter functions, there are others available, such as contrast, invert, and saturate. As with any powerful feature, it's important to kind of be careful with how you use the filters to enhance your design without overwhelming your users or compromising accessibility.
What is CSS Flexbox and when should you use it? CSS Flexbox is a one-dimensional layout model that allows you to arrange elements in rows and columns within a container. You can also control their order and orientation. Web developers use it to create responsive websites and web applications that adapt to different screen sizes and orientations. We refer to Flexbox as a one-dimensional layout model because it focuses on arranging elements along a single axis at a time. The axis can be either horizontal or vertical. There are two key concepts that you should know about before you start working with Flexbox: Flex Container and Flex Item. A Flex Container is an HTML element with a Flex layout. You can arrange and align elements in various ways within a Flex Container. To make an HTML element a Flex Container, you just need to add display flex to its CSS styles. Flex items are the direct children of a Flex Container. These elements can be arranged and aligned within a Flex Container based on its properties. They can also shrink or expand to fit the available space. This is an example with a main container and 3 child divs. If you only set the width, height, and background color of these divs in the CSS style sheet, every child element will be placed on its own row because the container is not flex by default. But if you do add display flex to the main container, the divs will be rearranged to fit on the same row, and they will shrink if necessary. By default, a Flex Container will be a block level element, so the container itself will be on its own row relative to other elements and containers. Now that you know more about Flex Containers and Flex Items, you should also know about Flex Properties. These properties determine how Flex items will be arranged, resized, and distributed within the Flex Container. Some of the most commonly used ones are Flex Direction, Justify Content, Align Items, and Flex Wrap. Great, now let's talk a little bit about the Flex model. This model defines how Flex items are arranged within a Flex Container. Every Flex Container has 2 axes, the main axis and the cross axis. The orientation of these axes determines how different properties will affect the layout and distribution of Flex items. By default, the main axis of a Flex Container is horizontal, and the cross axis is vertical. Flex items are arranged in the direction of the main axis. The cross axis is perpendicular to the main axis. The Flex Direction property sets the direction of the main axis. The default value of Flex Direction is row, which places all of the Flex items on the same row, in the direction of your browser's default language, left to right or right to left. To reverse the items in the row, you can use Flex Direction Row Reverse. Here you can see that the green div is now all the way to the left when it used to be all the way to the right, so the order was successfully reversed. If you want to align the Flex items vertically instead, you just need to set Flex Direction to Column in the Flex Container. This will change the direction of the main axis. Now the divs will be aligned vertically because the main axis will be vertical and the cross axis will be horizontal. You can also reverse the order of the Flex items vertically with Flex Direction Column Reverse. Now the green div is at the top when it used to be at the bottom, so the order was reversed. CSS Flexbox is a powerful layout model that provides a flexible and efficient way to arrange elements within a container. By understanding the key concepts of Flex Containers, Flex Items, and the various Flex properties, you can create dynamic and responsive websites that adapt to different screen sizes and orientations. What are some common flex properties and how do they work? Flex properties are properties that you can apply to flex containers to determine the distribution of child elements. We'll cover some of the most commonly used ones: flex wrap, justify content, and align items. Let's start with flex wrap. This property determines how flex items are wrapped within a flex container to fit the available space. Flex wrap can take three possible values: no wrap, wrap, and wrap reverse. No wrap is the default value. Flex items won't be wrapped onto a new line, even if their width exceeds their container's width. For example, here we have our three divs. Let's focus on the width. The main container with the red border has a width of 200 pixels, while its three child divs combined have a width of 240 pixels, 80 pixels each. The width of the child divs exceeds the width of their container, but by default, they will be shrunk to fit the available space. If you do want to wrap them when they exceed the width of their container, you can set flex wrap on the flex container. The divs are now rearranged into two rows. You can wrap flex items in reverse order with flex wrap reverse. The flex flow property is a shorthand property for flex direction and flex wrap. In this example, we set flex direction to column and flex wrap to wrap reverse. Great, now let's talk about justify content. Justify content aligns the child elements along the main axis of the flex container. If you assign the value flex start to justify content, the flex items will be aligned to the start of the main axis. This could be horizontal or vertical. With justify content flex end, flex items are aligned to the end of the main axis, horizontally or vertically. To center the flex items along the main axis, you can use justify content center. To distribute the elements evenly along the main axis, you can use justify content space between. This will add some space between the flex items if needed. Here's an example. The elements are distributed evenly without additional space before or after the first and last elements. Then we have justify content space around, which distributes flex items evenly along the main axis, adding a space before the first item and after the last item. This additional space is half of the space between each pair of adjacent items. If there's only one item to distribute, it will be centered. And last but not least, we have justify content space evenly, which distributes the items evenly along the main axis. The space between the items and the space before and after the first and last elements are exactly the same. Great, now you know how to distribute flex items along the main axis. But you may also want to distribute them along the cross axis. Remember that the cross axis is perpendicular to the main axis. You can do this with the align items property. To center the items along the cross axis, you just need to add align items center to the flex container. In this example, the flex items are centered along the cross axis, which is vertical by default. If the cross axis is horizontal, they will be centered horizontally instead. In contrast, aligned items flex start aligns the items to the start of the cross axis. Here the cross axis is vertical, so the flex items are aligned to the top. And here the cross axis is horizontal, so the flex items are aligned to the left. The opposite is justify content flex end. This will align flex items to the end of the cross-axis, vertically or horizontally. To stretch the flex items along the cross-axis, you can use Align Items Stretch. This also works with elements that are automatically sized, such as those without a set width or height, or with only a minimum width or height. These flex items will stretch to fill the container in the direction of the cross-axis. There are other flex properties and values that you can choose from to create the responsive layout that you envision, but these are the most commonly used ones. With these CSS Flex properties and your new knowledge of the CSS Flex model, you can start creating responsive layouts to create smooth and inclusive user experiences across devices.
C'est juste que je voulais. Et je code pas trop. Voilà, non. Je- J'enlève le truc. Je désactive mon micro. Mais là, présentement, je suis juste en train de faire. J'essaie de reproduire ça. Et bon, c'est juste ça. Parce que c'est sur le parcours aussi de freeCodeCamp. Euh, bon, c'est ça que je fais actuellement. Et donc, je suis ici. Bon, c'est juste ça. Alors, c'est juste que quand je code, je désactive mon micro. Je code juste pour ne pas. Bon, pour ne pas trop parler en même temps, on fait tout ça. C'est ça. Si je fais un, je pense que l'autre ferait ici. On fait une carte. D'accord. Oui, oui, oui. Bon, je fais déjà de but. Donc, présentement, je me consacre sur le web. Donc là, je suis en train de faire HTML, CSS. Bon, après, JavaScript. Pour l'instant, c'est juste ça. Bon, et toi, alors? Ah oui, je connais. Bon, ouais, j'ai déjà entendu parler de ça. Ouais, un temps, j'avais commencé. Je- C'est ce que présentement, la plupart des trucs que je fais, c'est en anglais. Donc, c'est pour ça que j'ai pris freeCodeCamp. Mais un temps, j'étais juste ici. Et ouais, c'est aussi un bon site. Et je pense que, vu que je suis à l'aise en anglais, bon, je fais les deux. Donc, parfois, j'apprends en français, parfois, j'apprends en anglais. Ah, mais c'est cool. Ah, super. Et bon, tu fais quoi? Comment je peux dire ça? Ouais, tu fais quoi comme les types de projets que tu fais, tu pourrais faire avec HTML et CSS présentement? Parce que moi, je compte finir ça, bon, la semaine prochaine. J'ai juste envie de faire déjà trois grands projets juste avec HTML et CSS avant de continuer JavaScript. Donc, je sais pas trop si tu as les idées sur les types de projets parce que je pensais, bon, mon portfolio, je pensais avoir fait ça, mais je fais ça à la fin. Bon, pas à la fin, mais lorsque j'ai fini d'apprendre JavaScript. Voilà. Ouais, c'est ça. Ouais, ça c'est lorsque tu veux faire. C'est exactement ça. Présentement, l'idée c'est de prendre un site qui est déjà créé. Je sais de reproduire ça. Et j'ai pensé, bon, j'ai quand même, j'ai d'autres sites en tête. Déjà, je cherche un site en ligne et je reproduis ça juste pas, bon, exactement ça, vu que je vais pas trop me casser la tête sur le design. Donc, je vais juste essayer de reproduire le site. Et juste ça, bon, c'est ça que je pense. Et c'est quand même une bonne idée. Et tu te focalises plus sur le front-end ou bien le back-end. Ou bien tu apprends euh, tous les deux. Ah ouais, c'est ça. Ouais, j'avais jamais pensé à ça. C'est un peu, je regarde. Ouais, c'est ça. J'avais déjà regardé. Parce qu'à un moment donné, je faisais un site de e-commerce avec Django. Et à un moment donné, j'avais regardé des trucs comme ça. Je pense, ouais, c'est quand même bon de dire. Et aussi, ouais, c'est ça. Je viens juste le faire. Je prends juste ça, j'essaie de coder. Et aussi, un site comme ça. C'est, voilà, c'est front-end mentor. Bon, un truc comme ça, le challenge qui sont ici. Bon, là, c'est plus. Là, c'est lorsque tu veux faire des trucs. Bon, tu prends le challenge et tu essaies de faire ça desktop, tablette et mobile. Bon, c'est ça pour que ça soit plus responsif. Et bon, c'est ça. Je compte aussi faire des trucs comme ça. Déjà, je commence un challenge un peu comme ça. Ça serait cool. Bon, c'est sûr que pour l'instant, j'ai envie de finir. J'ai envie de finir ça d'ici la semaine prochaine. J'ai juste envie de finir. J'ai juste envie de finir le truc si. J'ai juste envie de finir ça. Parce que ça a duré chez mes CSS. Ouais, je vais juste finir ça la semaine prochaine. Après, je crée. Bon, je vais juste créer 5 projets. Bon, c'est un site max. Alors, si j'ai le temps. Sinon, je vais faire 3 et puis je vais voir. Puis je vais voir le reste. Ah ouais, c'est ça. C'est net les étapes que je pensais à faire. Quasiment pensé à faire. C'est net les étapes que je pensais à faire. Parce que présentement, je fais HTML, CSS. Puis JavaScript. Je fais le projet après maintenant. Avant d'apprendre React, je vais d'abord apprendre Tailwind, CSS. Parce que je connais Bootstrap, mais Bootstrap n'est pas. Ça, bon, ça a déjà des trucs prédéfinis. Donc, c'est pas comme tu n'as pas quasiment le contrôle total. Donc, je pense que ce sont les 3, les 4 prochaines étapes. Bon, JavaScript, euh, Tailwind, CSS, puis React. Après, maintenant, je vais essayer de laisser le front-end et me focaliser un peu sur le back-end. Je pense que c'est une bonne idée. C'est faire son site seulement avec CSS, c'est beaucoup de code. Bon, ils sont petits. C'est pas là, c'est. Non, c'est pas ça. Oui, c'est. Je sais pas trop comment. Je sais pas trop le retard parce que je sais pas si c'est moi. Non, je pense que c'est chez moi. Parce que je vois directement que je vois, je réponds. Mais comment dire, il y a un retard sur l'enregistrement dehors. Je pense que c'est ça parce que ça vient directement et je réponds directement. Donc je pense que c'est. Ouais, ouais, c'est ça, c'est ça. C'est c'est exactement, c'est l'application qui retarde un peu. Je sais pas pourquoi ça fait ça. Je sais pas trop s'il y a un truc qu'il faut configurer ou quoi que ce soit. Parce que directement, je vois le message. Directement, je réponds. Mais je sais pas si c'est l'application qui ralentit. Bon, mais je pense que c'est ça. Parce que je remarque même que ce n'est pas direct. Donc, c'est ça qui pose problème. Mais bon, j'ai pas le choix. Je vais juste faire comme ça avec. Ouais, c'est ça. Ça, c'est un truc que je vais quand même me renseigner pour voir. Je sais pas s'il y a un truc qu'il faut faire. Je sais pas trop s'il y a un truc qu'il faut faire. Je pense qu'il y a un truc qu'il faut faire. Ah, parce que je suis en train de faire. Je suis en train de faire deux. Je sais pas trop si c'est parce que je suis sur YouTube que ça me dérange. Je sais pas, je vais voir ça. Mhm. Ok, bon. Ok, voilà. Bon, comment je fais pour agrandir le taille? Bon, je vais voir ça après. Ça c'est. Bon, ça c'est align safe n. Est-ce que ça se dit? Et bon. Ah, ok, flexstat. Ah, je vois. Je pense que c'est ça. Ok, bon. On va juste ajuster. Ok, bon. Maintenant, il va falloir mettre un moteur. Et c'est pas pourquoi il y a le temps. Et j'en ai un shadow. Et ici. Bon, ok. Maintenant, je veux cibler. Carte. Div. c'est un truc. Non. C'est pas aligné. Comment ça? Ok. C'est plutôt. Mais. Là. Là maintenant c'est parfait. Il va falloir faire un deuxième. Mais c'est pas noir. Pourquoi c'est rouge? Pourquoi c'est. Oh, c'est noir. Je dis pas que je dois acheter la couleur. Ok. Bon. Je vais mettre un truc qui est hot. Oh, je vais mettre tout ce qui est un truc. Ça serait une couleur. Juste ça. Voilà. Ici. Bon. On va prendre ça. Une fois maintenant, il va prendre le milieu. Ok, je vois ce que je vais faire. Copier, coller. Maintenant, on va mettre une classe, une fête. Tout ce qui est la classe, une fête, serait inversé. Ok. C'est pas ça. Voilà. Et j'ai plus besoin de ça. pas mal. Ok. Attends, je fais- Hmm. Voilà, je pense. Ok. Non, ça n'est pas. C'est- La taille n'est pas. Ouais. Moi, c'est beaucoup, ça devient un peu complexe. Ok. Bon. Quête. Discute. Ok. Oh, j'ai sauté. Ok. c'est un truc, c'est ça. Ok. C'est indéniable. Comment c'est représenté? Je sais pas trop. J'ai oublié. Bon. Bon, excusez-moi, je sais même pas comment si c'est représenté. Ok. Je vois. Passez-moi. ressemble à quelque chose. Bon. Oh, j'ai mis mon pied, il fait ça. Je rectifie mon code. Bon, ça c'est correct. Ça. Qu'est-ce que